I'm making an aesthetic claim, right? I'm arguing that it's possible to feel good about reading Kafka, more than it is possible to enjoy reading Kafka. Ultimately, I can make as many arguments as I want, but I can't convince someone who reads it differently than I do. Conversely, as many arguments as I want will be sort of unsatisfying if I don't tell you what I feel when I'm reading the stories. That's the only possible way you could, with good confidence, agree with me, right? If I just explain like what the story means in analytic terms, it just doesn't have any sort of weight. It's a meaningless argument. So at this point, I'm going to abandon any hope of, evidence and proving my claim by reference to the texts at hand. I'm just going to describe what I find in them. So, the predicament of the law is that the law is present, is all destructive and all-consuming, and that if it weren't present, life would be even worse. And it's that gives us the trouble, right? It's that on the one hand, we cannot reject the law, and on the other hand, we feel that we cannot accept it either. The law is cruel. It kills people randomly. It is guarded by large people with beards who let people die of old age as they stay outside the door of the law. The law has no real interactions with human beings. The law is unknown. The law is kept by nobles who may or may not actually be using it. But somehow it's better than the alternative. And that, I'd argue, is the positive feature. What do we gain if we have a monstrous law, rather than if we simply admitted that we are ruled by no laws, and that all there is the whim of the people who are stronger than us? We gain a capacity for tragedy. Before the law would be impossible if it were about a guy who was going to a room where very strong people were, hoping that one of them would help him, I don't know, beat up someone who stole something from him. If the story were about strength, it would be uninteresting. A good story could be written in that vein, right? You could write a very good story about people who have the power to do something, but who refuse it to the supplicant who comes to them. In fact, it's been done in Greek drama quite a lot. A tragedy called The Supplicants is the main one I'm thinking of. But it wouldn't be the same story, and it certainly wouldn't have the same character of beautiful tragedy. Imperial Message has something of the same degree. The Emperor's Last Message, one can argue, is a decree of some sort. It's a command for this one person. So fundamentally important that he whispers it to the messenger on his deathbed. And the messenger can never get the command out, and that's the tragedy. You get it in some fashion. You dream it to yourself, but do you take it seriously? Who knows? You take it seriously as you take any dream. The law, though it exists, and though it may even be benevolent, certainly it's unclear that the emperor hates you somehow, but the law is inaccessible. You can't separate it from everything else you dream. But at the same time, there being a law in the first place means that there can be genuine tragedy. Similar to why we read Kafka at all, is why we read tragedy at all. The Greek tragedies can be fun to read. This is something that, at least when I was reading the Greek tragedies for the first time, I found deeply troubling. There's something amoral, or it seems at first, about reading the Oedipus cycle and somehow enjoying it. So many bad things happen to a character who is so morally upstanding. And so little is done about this, that the fact that we enjoy the Oedipus cycle on any level strikes us at first as horrifying. But eventually we get over it, right? Eventually, we're capable of enjoying Greek tragedy, or any tragedy at all. Eventually we can enjoy watching Hamlet, or reading Hamlet, or King Lear, or Macbeth. All of these share the point that we shouldn't enjoy them, but we do. And what's more, ultimately, we don't feel that we're enjoying them for the wrong reasons. I'm going to make a rather bold claim and say that nobody here who enjoys reading Hamlet feels guilty about reading Hamlet. There's a sense that the enjoyment you're deriving from Hamlet is not just some sort of Nietzschean, I like it when other people suffer, right? There's a sense that you're not actually being cruel, that you run the risk of being cruel, right? That's why often reading tragedy at first is so distressing. How am I supposed to enjoy this? I can't enjoy this. People suffer. But it's possible to enjoy the art, to find beauty in the occurrence, without approving of the actual events. it's possible to read Hamlet and be pleased by Hamlet, without necessarily thinking that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern need to be sent to their deaths. A similar thing goes on with Kafka. Searching for meaning, both in existentialist literature and in sort of the general human, where is the good stuff, comes in two fashions. There's a search for sort of meaning in the explicit textual, analytical sense of what does it mean, right? One of the things that religion attempts to, with varying degrees of success, satisfy is the my life ought to have a meaning, there ought to be a moral to the story of my life. The other things besides religion attempt to fill this void too. But at the second part, there's sort of the underlying question of whether or not there's meaning, how can I find any joy in my life once I'm aware of the existential abyss? Or, to bring this down a level, because we don't actually need the full power of the existential abyss, once I'm aware of suffering, right? How is it possible to be pleased with my life when I'm aware both of the suffering that happens to me and of the probably much worse suffering that happens to everybody else, right? I think no matter how hard any of our quarters have been, we can all perfectly easily agree that there are people in the world who have it far worse than we do. In fact, it's often a thought experiment I do to see how much do I object to my own suffering and how much do I object to suffering that happens in general. Suffering that happens to other people is a lot worse. We find that as horrifying to some degree as the suffering that happens to us. It's the fact of suffering that's troubling, not just that it occasionally happens to me. And this is one of the things that happens with tragedy. Tragedy does not attempt to argue that the world is without suffering. In fact, the whole point of tragedy as rigidly defined, is that bad things happen to good people. That is my shortening of Aristotle's definition of tragedy. Aristotle also argued that the good person to whom this happens must be a noble. Okay, I don't buy that. But the underlying spirit is bad things happen to good people. There is suffering. The suffering has to be as bad as possible. Aristotle actually describes what makes a tragedy is the moment of recognition. Right? When Oedipus realizes that he has married his mother and killed his father. And Aristotle describes how tragic the moment of recognition can be. There's different ways it can happen, right? You can commit the act, a long time goes by, and then you recognize it. You can commit the act and immediately after recognize it. You can commit the act and in the course of committing the act, recognize it. And this is the weird one. You can recognize it before it happens, and then commit it anyways. Aristotle isn't clear on whether that is actually ever done. And he's also not clear on whether that's actually possible. But he says that if you could do it, that will be the most tragic. And he means that in a positive way. The best way that a tragedy could happen. Tragedies are all about suffering. The thing that we find beautiful in a tragedy is made better the more persuasive and the more universal the suffering is. A tragedy in which the main character breaks a finger is almost impossible to write. The only way I see that that could be written is if that moment had such significance for the main character that it took on the aura surrounding actually great sufferings that we all sort of imagine. Oedipus has to kill one of his family members, marry the other, and then blind himself and wander aimlessly in the wilderness before we feel satisfied with him. It's not enough for him simply to have accidentally killed his father. That would be normally a terrible, terrible thing. He has to go one level further. He has to wipe out everything and have everything wiped out for him. And the same thing happens for Kafka. I think that the reason Kafka doesn't allow us to question the sort of good or bad nature of the law is that it would be getting off too easy. If we say the law is good, we sort of deny suffering. If the law is good, then it's all for the best in this best of possible worlds, and so there's nothing really tragic. If we say that the law is bad, then we're implicitly saying that we can make a good law, right? The world